What's your desperate times call for desperate measures story? My golden retriever robot was having seizures when I rushed him into the emergency vet at 2 in the morning, but the receptionist wouldn't let anyone examine him without $800 up front, and my credit card was declined. Robot was foaming at the mouth with labored breathing, while everyone in the waiting room watched me beg for an exception. I called my ex-wife, who laughed and hung up. My brother's phone went straight to voicemail. My parents were on a cruise ship somewhere in the Caribbean. Robot had gone from seizures to barely breathing, and his gums were turning white. A man in the waiting room stood up and shouted that this was animal cruelty, but the receptionist calmly explained that they were a business and couldn't provide free services. "That dog is dying right in front of you," he said, pulling out his phone to record. She responded by pointing to a sign that said, "Recording was prohibited on the premises." Another woman offered me $200 in cash, but that still left me $600 short, and the receptionist wouldn't accept partial payment. I suddenly remembered my neighbor Dr. Claire was a veterinarian, and I still had her number from when I watered her plants last summer. We weren't close, but desperation made me call her at 3 in the morning. She answered groggily, but when she heard Robot seizing in the background, she said she'd be there in 10 minutes. She burst through the clinic doors in pajamas and sneakers, took one look at Robot, and marched straight past the reception desk. The receptionist started protesting, but Dr. Claire flashed her veterinary license and said she was taking responsibility for this emergency case. "This dog is going into organ failure," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear while examining Robot on the waiting room floor. The clinic vet suddenly appeared from the back looking annoyed, but Dr. Claire started rattling off medical terminology about toxicity levels and liability issues. Something about her tone made him back down, and he agreed to examine Robot immediately. They rushed him into the back while Dr. Claire stayed with me, explaining she could only get him examined but not pay for any treatment he might need. The veterinarian came out 40 minutes later and told me Robot had ingested rat poison and needed immediate treatment, costing $3,200 up front. I stared at him in disbelief, and he said their policy was strict about payment before treatment, especially for critical cases that required expensive medications and overnight monitoring. Dr. Claire tried to intervene, but he said she'd already overstepped enough, and this was a business matter now. "Your dog will die without this treatment," he said matter-of-factly, "but I can give you some time to figure out payment options." I asked how much time Robot had left, and he checked his watch before saying maybe 2 hours if we were lucky. He handed me an estimate sheet and walked back through the door, while Dr. Claire apologized and said she wished she could do more, but she didn't have the money on hand either. The man who'd been recording earlier offered me $500, but that still left me $2,700 short. I asked the receptionist if I could at least buy the medications directly and administer them myself, but she said only licensed veterinarians could handle controlled substances. I could hear Robot whimpering from somewhere in the back and asked if I could see him while I tried to figure something out. The receptionist said he was being kept comfortable, but visiting would require signing liability waivers that were part of the treatment package I hadn't paid for yet. Dr. Claire looked disgusted and walked out saying she needed to make some calls. I sat in that waiting room watching the clock, and knowing every minute that passed brought Robot closer to death. The other people had mostly left, but the man with the $500 was still there, pressing the money into my hand, saying he wished he could do more. I made a decision right then that would probably destroy my life, but might save Robot. I told the receptionist I needed to get something from my car and walked out into the parking lot where I made a phone call I'd sworn I'd never make. My old college roommate Zeke picked up on the third ring even though it was 3:30 in the morning. "I'll do it," I said, without even saying hello. "Whatever you need me to do for your business, I'll do it, but I need $3,200 in the next hour." Zeke laughed and said he'd been waiting 2 years for this call. "Check your phone," he said, and the payment notification popped up instantly. I walked back inside and paid for Robot's treatment, but as they wheeled him away, Zeke texted me 5 words that made my blood run cold. "Your first pickup is tonight." I slumped into one of those hard plastic chairs in the waiting room and watched the clock above the reception desk tick past 4 in the morning. My hands were still shaking from making that call to Zeke, and those 5 words kept repeating in my head. The receptionist typed away at her computer while I sat there trying not to think about what I'd just agreed to. My phone buzzed with a text from Zeke containing an address and a time for tonight, but nothing else. The man who'd given me $500 had left after I paid for Robot's treatment, and now it was just me and 2 other people waiting. I could hear machines beeping from somewhere in the back, and every few minutes a tech would walk past the door, but nobody told me anything about Robot. The coffee machine in the corner was broken, and my stomach was too twisted up to eat anything from the vending machine anyway. Another text came through from Zeke saying to download some app I'd never heard of, and that all future instructions would come through there. I spent the next hour just staring at the wall and jumping every time someone walked through the doors. Around 5:31 of the text came out and said Robot was responding to treatment, but they needed to keep monitoring him closely. She wouldn't let me see him yet, and went back through the doors before I could ask more questions. The waiting felt endless, and my phone kept buzzing with notifications from that encrypted app Zeke made me download. Finally, at 6 in the morning, the vet came out looking tired and told me Robot was stable. He said the poison had done damage to Robot's kidneys and liver, but they'd managed to stop it from getting worse. Robot would need to stay for at least 48 hours of monitoring, and there might be more costs depending on how his kidney function tests came back. The relief hit me so hard my legs went weak, and I had to sit back down. He gave me some papers to sign and said I could call later to check on Robot, but visiting hours didn't start until noon. I stumbled out to my car feeling completely drained and drove home on autopilot. The sun was coming up and normal people were heading to work, while my life had just taken a turn I couldn't undo. When I pulled into my apartment complex, I remembered Robot had been sniffing around the dumpster area yesterday before he got sick. I walked over there and sure enough found 3 rat bait stations tucked behind the dumpster where any dog could get to them. The boxes were cracked open and poison pellets were scattered on the ground. My anger flared up, seeing how carelessly the property management had placed these things. I took photos of everything with my phone, including the warning labels that said to keep away from pets. This was their fault, and they were going to hear about it once Robot was better. I went inside and collapsed on my couch, still wearing the same clothes from last night. The encrypted app buzzed again, and this time it was detailed instructions from Zeke. I was supposed to meet someone named Donovan Bishop at a gas station on the south side at 8 tonight. The message said to tell him I was picking up car parts for a friend, and he'd know what to do. I tried to sleep, but kept thinking about what I was getting into and whether Robot would really be okay. That afternoon, I forced myself to eat something and shower before the meeting. The gas station was 20 minutes away in a part of town I usually avoided. I got there 5 minutes early and parked next to the air pump like the instructions said. A guy in a Toyota pulled up next to me and rolled down his window. He looked completely normal, wearing khakis and a polo shirt like any suburban dad heading home from work. "You picking up those car parts?" he asked, and I nodded. He got out and opened his trunk, pulling out a sealed package about the size of a shoebox. "Delivery address is on the label," he said, handing it to me. "Never open it and never deviate from the instructions." He got back in his car and drove off without another word. The package felt heavier than it looked, and I put it in my trunk, trying not to think about what was inside. The address on the label was for an office building 30 minutes north, and the instructions said to leave it in the mailbox by the back entrance. I white-knuckled the steering wheel the whole drive, checking my mirrors constantly for cops. The office building was dark and empty when I got there, and I found the mailbox exactly where the instructions said. I dropped the package inside and got out of there as fast as I could without speeding. My heart was still pounding when I was miles away, and I kept checking to make sure nobody was following me. About 10 minutes into my drive home, I noticed a dark sedan that had been behind me since I left the office building. I took a random right turn, and the sedan followed. I took another turn, and it was still there. Panic set in, and I took 3 more random turns through a residential neighborhood before the car finally disappeared. The paranoia hit me hard, realizing this was my life now. I'd be constantly looking over my shoulder, worried about cops or whoever else might be watching. My phone rang as soon as I got home, and it was Donovan Bishop. "First run complete," he said in that same calm voice. "Few rules going forward." He told me to never bring my personal phone on runs and never break a seal no matter what. Everything had to be exactly on time, with no exceptions or excuses. His tone stayed matter-of-fact, but the threats underneath were clear. "Zeke says you're good for 10 runs to clear your debt," he said before hanging up. The next morning, the clinic called saying Robot's kidney numbers were concerning and he'd need intravenous fluids for another day. The vet said it would be $1,200 for the additional treatment and monitoring. It felt like getting punched in the stomach, but at least Robot was alive and getting better. That afternoon, I went back to the clinic to drop off the $500 in an envelope for the stranger who'd helped me. The receptionist promised to hold it for him when he came back. Returning his kindness was the only thing that felt good in all this chaos. My phone started ringing around 7 that evening while I was heating up leftover Chinese food. The caller ID showed my ex-wife's number, and I almost didn't answer but figured she'd just keep calling. "You're so irresponsible with that dog," she started before I could even say hello. I set the phone on speaker and kept eating while she went on about how I probably left rat poison lying around myself. When I reminded her she'd laughed and hung up when Robot was dying, she got even louder. "That's not the point," she said, and then started listing every mistake I'd made during our marriage. I told her she could have helped save him, but chose not to, and she screamed something about me always playing the victim before hanging up. The next morning, my boss called me into his office before I could even get to my desk. He closed the door and pulled out a folder with my attendance records from the past week. 3 late arrivals and 1 no-show, he said, tapping the papers. He explained that corporate was cracking down on attendance, and 1 more incident would mean a formal write-up. A write-up would go in my permanent file and could block any raises or promotions for a year. I needed this job more than ever now, with robots' bills and whatever Zeke might drag me into. My boss said he understood people had personal issues, but the company had policies he had to enforce. I promised it wouldn't happen again, and he gave me that look that said he'd heard it before. That night around 10, my phone buzzed with instructions from Zeke about picking up cash from someone at Sunset Lane's bowling alley. This was different from just moving packages, and my hands were shaking as I drove there. I parked in the back like the message said, and sat there for 10 minutes trying to work up the nerve to go inside. The bowling alley was packed with league night, and I had no idea how to find my contact. I walked around pretending to look for someone while checking every face against the vague description Zeke had sent. 20 minutes passed and nobody approached me or gave any kind of signal. 30 minutes turned into 40, and I started to panic, thinking maybe I'd missed them somehow. My phone stayed silent, and I couldn't risk calling Zeke to ask what to do. At 45 minutes, I decided to leave, figuring something must have gone wrong on their end. I was barely out of the parking lot when Donovan called, and his voice was ice cold. "You left 15 minutes early," he said without even a greeting. I tried explaining that the contact never showed, but he cut me off saying protocol was to wait the full hour no matter what. He said walking away early could mean the contact thought I was compromised or being watched. "This isn't some game where you make up your own rules," he said before hanging up. 2 days later, Dr. Claire knocked on my door, holding a bag of groceries she said were extras from her shopping trip. She came in and started explaining how brodifacoum worked while putting food in my fridge. It was a 2nd-generation anticoagulant that stopped blood from clotting and could take days to fully leave a dog's system. She asked specific questions about where exactly I'd found Robot that night before he got sick. I showed her the photos on my phone of the green bait boxes near the dumpster behind our building. She studied them closely and said the placement violated several safety codes for pest control in residential areas. "You should document everything," she said, writing down the brand name visible on the boxes. The next morning, I called 3 different pet insurance companies trying to get coverage for Robot's future care. Each one asked about pre-existing conditions, and when I mentioned the poisoning, they all said the same thing. Any future issues related to the poisoning or his organs wouldn't be covered since it happened before the policy started. The woman at the 3rd company sounded genuinely sorry, but explained their underwriters had strict rules about pre-existing conditions. Even routine care would cost more now, because Robot was flagged as high risk in their system. She suggested looking into care credit or payment plans through the vet instead. 3 nights later, I had another delivery run, and everything was going smooth until I hit a surprise police checkpoint on Maple Street. They were checking for drunk drivers and had 3 lanes down to 1 with officers at each car. The package in my trunk felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds as I inched forward in line. The officer shined his flashlight in my face and asked where I was coming from, and I said a friend's house. He looked at my eyes for signs I was high or drunk, then waved me through without checking anything else. My shirt was soaked with sweat, and I had to pull into a gas station parking lot to calm down. My hands wouldn't stop shaking for 20 minutes, and I kept checking the mirrors for cops. The next week, Donovan met me for a package exchange in a mall parking garage. While we switched bags between cars, he mentioned his daughter had leukemia, and the treatments cost more than his regular job paid. "Everyone in this has their reasons," he said, closing his trunk. His son was 12 and wanted to play travel baseball, but that cost money too. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and got back in my car. It was weird thinking of him as a dad coaching Little League instead of a criminal moving drugs. A few days later, Dr. Claire came by again, and I couldn't keep lying to her. I told her I'd gotten mixed up in something bad to pay for Robot's treatment, but didn't mention names. She sat quietly while I explained I was delivering things I shouldn't be and couldn't see a way out. "You need to document everything," she said, grabbing a notepad. She wrote down names of lawyers who might help and numbers for anonymous tip lines if things got worse. "Whatever you're doing, find an exit strategy before it destroys your life," she said, squeezing my hand. The next afternoon, I went to visit Robot at the clinic and walked into my ex-wife arguing with the receptionist about the bill. She was waving papers around and demanding to know why she was listed as a contact for payment. I tried to slip past, but she saw me and started yelling about me putting her name on forms without permission. Dr. Claire must have heard the commotion because she came out from the back and stepped between us. "This is a place of healing," she said in that calm vet voice. My ex-wife started to argue, but Dr. Claire just kept talking about how Robot needed a peaceful environment to recover. Something about her tone made my ex back down, and she actually walked over to look at Robot through the window. She put her hand on the glass and watched him sleeping on his blanket for a minute before leaving without another word. 3 days later, Zeke called while I was eating breakfast and said he needed me to the store something at my place for a couple nights. My stomach dropped because having anything illegal in my apartment would destroy me if cops showed up. I told him absolutely not and suggested a storage unit instead, since that would keep distance between me and whatever he needed stored. He went quiet for a moment, then agreed, but said I had to set it up today and pay cash using a fake name. I drove across town to a place that looked run down enough not to ask questions and rented a small unit in the back corner. The manager barely looked at me when I paid 3 months up front in cash and signed the forms as Mike Johnson. Zeke met me there an hour later with a black duffel bag that felt way heavier than clothes or normal stuff would be. I forced myself not to think about what might be inside as I locked it in the unit and memorized the combination. The next morning, someone knocked on my door, and I opened it to find a woman in business clothes holding a police badge. Detective Caitlin Evans introduced herself and said she was investigating package thefts in the building. She asked if I'd noticed anything suspicious lately, and I worked hard to keep my voice steady while saying I hadn't seen anything unusual. She handed me her card and said to call if I remembered anything, then mentioned she'd be talking to all the residents over the next few days. After she left, I sat on my couch for 20 minutes trying to calm down even though she hadn't been there about me. Later that week, I went back to the vet clinic and asked the receptionist if she still had contact info for the man who'd offered me $500. She said she couldn't give out personal information, but agreed to call him for me. He showed up an hour later and seemed surprised when I handed him an envelope with his money back. He tried to refuse it, but I explained Robot was doing better, and I wanted to repay his kindness. He finally took it and said he was just glad my dog survived, then shook my hand before leaving. The next day at work, my boss called me into his office and slid a paper across the desk. It was a final warning letter that would go in my personnel file stating any more absences or performance issues would result in immediate termination. He said he understood I'd been dealing with personal stuff, but the company had policies, and he couldn't keep making exceptions. I signed it, knowing I had zero room for error now, and any screw-up would cost me my job and health insurance. A few days later, the vet called to say Robot was having more seizures and needed special medication that cost $800 a month. Insurance wouldn't cover it since they considered it experimental treatment for poisoning cases. I sat in the parking lot staring at the estimate and knowing I didn't have that kind of money. I swallowed what was left of my pride and called Zeke to ask for an advance on future work. He laughed and said he'd transfer the money, but I'd have to take on a riskier delivery route through neighborhoods where cops were always watching. I agreed, because Robot needed that medication and hung up feeling like I was sinking deeper into quicksand. The next pickup was different, because curiosity finally got the better of me, and I carefully peeled back the tape on one corner of the package. Inside were plastic bags full of pills that I recognized from news stories about the drug crisis. Seeing them made everything real in a way it hadn't been when I was just moving sealed packages. My hands shook as I pressed the tape back down and tried to make it look like nothing had been touched. 2 nights later, when I met Donovan in our usual spot, he immediately noticed something was off with the package seal. His whole body went stiff, and he asked what happened to it. I kept my face blank and said it came to me that way from whoever packed it. He stared at me for what felt like forever, then said, if it happened again, there would be serious problems. After he drove away, I sat in my car, knowing he didn't believe me and wondering how much danger I was really in. A week later, Detective Evans showed up at my door again, but this time she was asking about storage facilities in the area. She said there had been break-ins and showed me a list of units they were checking. My blood went cold when I saw my unit number on the paper, but I kept my voice steady and said I didn't know anything about storage places. She thanked me and left, but I knew I had to move that bag immediately before they got a warrant or something. That afternoon, I finally worked up the nerve to go to the property management office with all my photos of the rat bait boxes. I slammed the pictures on the desk and demanded they take responsibility for nearly killing my dog. The property manager tried to brush me off, but I had vet records showing the exact type of poison and threatened to call the health department about unsafe bait placement. After an hour of arguing, she said she'd have to discuss it with corporate, but they might be willing to work out some kind of settlement. 3 days passed before corporate called back, and I had to do another pickup for Zeke while waiting, this time meeting a guy in a beat-up sedan behind a closed restaurant. He popped his trunk to grab the package, and that's when I saw 2 handguns sitting next to boxes of ammo and what looked like bags of pills. My stomach dropped because this wasn't just about drugs anymore, and I grabbed the package quickly, trying not to stare at the weapons while he watched me with dead eyes. The drive home felt longer than usual, and I kept checking my mirrors, thinking about what would happen to Robot if I got arrested or killed doing this stuff. That same afternoon, I went to the electronics store and bought a dash cam with cash, telling the clerk it was for insurance purposes after someone hit my car. Installing it took 20 minutes in the parking lot, and I angled it to catch both the windshield view and part of my side window where exchanges happened. I tested the recording feature and made sure the memory card had enough space for multiple runs, knowing this was dangerous, but needing some kind of protection. Later that evening, I asked Dr. Claire to come over, and when she sat down, I told her everything about Zeke and the packages and the money for Robot's treatment. She listened without interrupting while I explained about the guns I'd seen and how trapped I felt, her face getting more serious with each detail. When I finished, she said she couldn't report me because of doctor-patient confidentiality, even though I wasn't technically her patient, but she also couldn't actively help with anything illegal. She did say, if I decided to go to the police, she'd support me as a character witness about Robot's poisoning and my desperation. The next morning, I texted Detective Evans, asking if she wanted to grab coffee to discuss the neighborhood thefts, and she agreed to meet at a diner downtown. We sat in a back booth, and after some small talk about break-ins, I started asking hypothetical questions about what happens when someone gets caught up in something illegal but wants to cooperate. She stirred her coffee slowly and said, hypothetically speaking, people who come forward voluntarily and provide useful information usually get much better deals than those who get caught first. She explained how cooperation agreements work and mentioned that first-time offenders who help solve bigger cases often avoid jail time completely. I nodded and changed the subject, but we both knew this wasn't really about hypothetical situations. That night, I sat in my apartment weighing everything and decided I'd do one more fully documented run with the dash cam, capturing everything, then take it all to the police. It was risky, but staying in Zeke's operation meant eventually getting caught or hurt, and Robot needed me alive and free. The next afternoon, the clinic called, and the vet said Robot was finally stable enough to come home after almost 2 weeks of treatment. He went over the medication schedule, which included pills 3 times a day and special food that cost $40 a bag. Knowing Robot would be back with me soon made me more determined to get out of this mess safely. That night's pickup was at a gas station, and I made sure the dash cam was recording as I pulled up next to a black SUV. The driver handed me the package through his window, and I caught his face clearly on camera, along with his license plate when he pulled away. The delivery location was a house in a nice neighborhood, and I recorded the address and the woman who answered the door, forcing myself to act normal while gathering evidence. The whole run took 2 hours, and I saved the footage to my laptop as soon as I got home, making backup copies on flash drives. 2 days later, Zeke called with a weird request to pick up an empty box from an address he'd never used before and bring it to another new location. Something felt off about the whole thing, and when I got to the pickup spot, nobody was there, just an empty box sitting on a bus bench. I grabbed it and drove to the delivery address, which turned out to be an abandoned building, and that's when I realized this was a test to see if anyone was following me. I dropped the empty box inside the door and texted Zeke that it was done, and he replied saying good job, but I could tell he was getting suspicious. The next evening, after a regular delivery, Donovan pulled me aside in the parking lot and said he'd been in this game long enough to see when someone wanted out. He mentioned there might be a way to square my debt with Zeke and walk away clean if I was interested. The offer sounded too good to be true, but I was desperate enough to hear him out, and he said he'd be in touch soon with details. Meanwhile, I'd been calling the property management company every day about the rat poison settlement and finally got through to someone with authority. After threatening to go to the media with photos of dead pets from their negligent bait placement, they agreed to reimburse me $2,500 for Robot's emergency treatment. The check would take 2 weeks to process, but having that validation that they were at fault felt like a small victory in all this chaos. 3 days later, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and started pulling together everything I'd documented. The dashcam footage from that last run showed clear faces and license plates, and I'd saved screenshots of every text from Zeke and Donovan. I opened the secure email Detective Evans had given me and started uploading files one by one, watching the progress bar creep across the screen. My hands shook as I typed out a summary of dates and locations, double-checking everything before hitting send. 20 minutes later, she texted back a simple confirmation that she'd received it all and warrants would be coming soon, but I needed to keep acting normal. That same afternoon, Zeke called and told me to empty the storage unit and move everything to a new location across town by tonight. I took a deep breath and told him no, that I was done with anything beyond basic deliveries. The silence stretched so long I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and cold, asking if I really wanted to do this. I said yes and hung up before he could respond, then immediately started packing a bag for Robot. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from Zeke that made my stomach drop. He said he knew where I lived and where Robot went to the vet, and maybe I should reconsider my position. I grabbed Robot's leash and drove straight to the clinic, my eyes checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. Dr. Claire was finishing up with a patient when I burst through the door carrying Robot and asked if she could board him immediately. She took one look at my face and nodded, leading us to the back without asking questions. I handed her $200 cash and said to keep him here no matter what, until I called, and she squeezed my shoulder and promised he'd be safe. On my way out, I noticed a car I didn't recognize parked across the street with someone sitting inside, so I took a different route home and parked 3 blocks away. That evening, my phone lit up with a text from Donovan saying we needed to talk urgently. He said to meet him at the gas station where we'd first met in 20 minutes and come alone. I almost didn't go, but something in his message felt different, less like a threat and more like a warning. When I pulled up, he was already there, standing by his car looking around nervously. He walked over and leaned against my door, speaking quietly about how Zeke was losing it and getting paranoid about everyone. He said the smart money was getting out now, and if I could lay low for 48 hours without doing anything stupid, there was a clean way to walk away. He handed me a piece of paper with an address and told me to be there tomorrow at noon, then got in his car and drove off without another word. The next morning, I drove to the address Donovan had given me, which turned out to be a law office downtown. Detective Evans was waiting in the lobby with another officer and a stenographer. They led me to a conference room where I spent 3 hours giving a formal statement about everything I'd seen and done. I handed over the dashcam memory card and my storage unit keys, pushing them across the table like I was getting rid of poison. Detective Evans looked through everything and said they had more than enough to move forward, but I'd need to testify if it went to trial. She pulled out a cooperation agreement and went through each section, explaining that I'd probably get probation and have to pay some fines, but no jail time if I stayed clean. The deal was better than I deserved, and I signed it immediately, my signature shaky but readable. She said arrests would start happening soon, and I should stay somewhere safe for a few days just in case. I went straight from the law office to the bank and withdrew $500, then drove to 3 different stores buying prepaid phones and basic supplies. The next morning, I was drinking coffee in a motel room 20 miles away when the news broke on my laptop. The headline said local authorities had arrested multiple suspects in a drug trafficking operation, and there was Zeke's mugshot staring back at me. The article mentioned the arrests came from an ongoing investigation, and more were expected as the network was still active. I knew there would be fallout, and probably people looking for whoever had talked, but at least the first phase was over. I spent the rest of that day at the motel making phone calls and tying up loose ends. I called the emergency vet fund I'd found online and made a $1,000 donation using the property management check that had finally arrived. The woman who answered thanked me and said it would help at least 3 families whose pets needed critical care. It wasn't enough to fix what I'd been part of, but it was something positive from all this mess. That afternoon, my ex-wife called, which shocked me since we hadn't talked civilly in over a year. She said she'd heard about Robot being at the clinic and wanted to visit him if that was okay. I told her where he was and that Dr. Claire was taking care of him, and she actually thanked me for letting her know. An hour later, she texted that she'd seen him and he looked good and we should talk about setting better boundaries going forward. She even said she wouldn't use any of this situation against me if things ever went back to court, which was more than I'd expected from her. 2 days later, Detective Evans called and confirmed my status in the investigation was secure as long as I followed all the cooperation terms. She said more arrests had been made and the prosecutor was happy with my assistance. I could come back home, but should stay alert and report anything suspicious immediately. I thanked her and drove back to my apartment, where I spent an hour deleting every app Zeke had made me download and blocking his number, along with everyone else from that world. The relief I felt wasn't complete, because I knew there would be court dates and probably threats, but the weight was finally starting to lift. The next morning, Dr. Claire called to say Robot was ready to come home, and I drove straight to the clinic with his favorite blanket in the back seat. He looked so thin when they brought him out, his ribs showing through his golden fur and his legs shaking with each step, but his tail started wagging the moment he saw me. The vet tech handed me a bag with 6 different medications and a schedule that looked like a spreadsheet, explaining each pill had to be given at specific times with or without food. I carried Robot to the car because he was too weak to jump in himself, and he pressed against me the whole drive home while I kept one hand on his head. Back at the apartment, I'd spent the previous night dog-proofing everything, moving all cleaning supplies to high cabinets, blocking access under the sink with child locks, and checking every corner for anything he might eat. I set up his bed in the living room where I could watch him constantly and arranged his medications in a pill organizer with alarms on my phone for each dose. He slept most of that first day, but would lift his head whenever I moved, making sure I wasn't leaving him again. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize, but I knew it was Donovan when I read the message saying he was taking his family to his sister's place in Oregon. He said the arrests had spooked everyone, and smart people were getting out while they could, and he hoped his daughter's new doctors would be as good as the ones here. I deleted the message immediately, but found myself hoping he'd find some legal way to pay for her treatment, because despite everything, I understood why he'd done what he did. The next Monday, I went back to work for the first time in almost 2 weeks, walking into my boss's office before he could summon me. I apologized for my recent performance and explained Robot had been seriously ill, but was recovering now, and I was ready to focus completely on my job. He studied me for a long moment before saying he'd noticed I seemed different, more serious somehow, and as long as I kept this focus, we could move past the recent issues. I threw myself into every project that week, staying late to catch up on everything I'd missed and volunteering for extra assignments to prove my commitment. My coworkers noticed the change too, one of them joking that I must have gotten religion or something, because I'd never worked this hard before. Friday afternoon, I found an envelope from the property management company in my mailbox containing a check for $2,500 and a letter saying, "This concluded our matter regarding the pest control incident." I deposited it immediately and used half to pay off the remaining vet bills, putting the rest in a new savings account I labeled Emergency Fund. Having even that small cushion made me breathe easier, knowing I wouldn't be desperate enough to make terrible choices if something happened again. Dr. Claire started stopping by every few days to check on Robot, bringing her stethoscope to listen to his heart and examining his gums to make sure he was recovering properly. We'd sit on my living room floor while she checked him over, talking about everything from her other patients to my legal situation, and I realized we'd become actual friends through this mess. She never judged me for what I'd done to save Robot, just kept reminding me that people make mistakes when they're desperate, and what mattered was making better choices going forward. 2 weeks after Robot came home, I had my first meeting with my probation officer at a gray government building downtown. She was younger than I expected, maybe 35, with short black hair and a no-nonsense attitude that made it clear she'd seen everything and wasn't interested in excuses. She went through my requirements one by one: monthly meetings, random drug tests, no leaving the state without permission, maintaining employment, paying all fines on schedule, and staying away from anyone involved in criminal activity. I signed every form she put in front of me and answered all her questions honestly, knowing this was my chance to avoid prison if I just followed the rules. She warned me that any violation would send me straight to jail and asked if I understood the seriousness of my situation, which I absolutely did. Over the next few weeks, Robot and I developed our new routine, starting with a slow walk around the apartment complex every morning while he rebuilt his strength. I'd give him his morning medications hidden in peanut butter, then head to work while he slept on his bed, coming home at lunch to check on him and give the afternoon pills. Evenings meant another walk, this time a little longer as he got stronger, then dinner for both of us and his nighttime medications before settling in to watch TV together. Dr. Claire would join us for his weekly checkups, saying his blood work was improving and his weight was coming back nicely. By the end of the second month, Robot was almost back to his old self, running after tennis balls at the dog park and scarfing down his food like he'd never been sick. 3 months after that terrible night at the emergency vet, I sat in my apartment watching Robot chew on a new toy while I paid my monthly probation fine online. He was completely healthy now, his coat shiny again and his energy fully restored, acting like the whole poisoning had never happened. I was meeting every requirement the court had set, never missing a check-in or failing a drug test, keeping my job and slowly paying off my legal debts. The whole experience had been a nightmare that nearly destroyed both our lives, but we'd made it through together, and I was determined to build something better from what was left. Thanks for letting me question things right alongside you. It's been a ride just wondering together. Until next time, Take care out there. Like the video, it helps more than you think.